proteins there are, there's already a nice little mathematical formula that tells you, well, it is the number 20, or the 20 different building blocks that you can use, raised to the length of the polymer. A medium-sized protein in our bodies is about 300 amino acids long. When you put the number 20 in your computer, in your calculator in your computer, and raise it to the 300th power, the calculator answers, either it crashes or answers infinity. In other words, there's an infinite number of possible proteins that can be made out of those 20 amino acids that are in turn made out of oxygen and carbon and nitrogen. Even longer proteins that exist, like hemoglobin, is made out of, the protein of your blood is made out of 3 strands that are 1,000 amino acids long. The number of possible proteins that can be made out of a plasma is in an infinity larger than the other infinity. Do we know all the properties of that infinite number? Of course we don't. And that is only talking about oxygen and proteins. Can you imagine we start talking about here hydrocarbons and all the kinds of molecules that carbon can form, and we start bringing the metals and iron and copper and zinc. The world is explosively combinatorial. There's an infinite number of organisms that can be produced, there's an infinite number of molecules that can be produced, there's an infinite number of combinations for everything, so there's never a final truth. So we can accept that Lavoisier discovered oxygen, and that oxygen exists for real, independently of our minds, and independently of who won the controversy in terms of political terms, and yet not accept that scientists are reaching the final truth. But that's going to be a fact about the world. The world, because of all these infinities in its combinatorial spaces, is open-ended. It has an open-ended becoming, particularly in planets like ours, which happen to be at just the right zone of intensity. Because Mars is a little too far from the Sun, it's a little too cold, and it displays less variability. Venus is a little too close to the Sun, it's a little too hot, and displays less variability. Planet Earth is in the right zone of intensity, the sweet spot, so to speak, at which the maximum number of variants can arise. And as long as humans don't come in and homogenize the entire thing by destroying rainforests and putting, identical suburban houses on top of them, as long as we are the only source of homogeneity and uniformization in this planet, everything else is just trying to escape. Everything else is trying to deterritorialize. We are the ones that bring the territories and encase animals in zoo cages and put things within their boxes. The world itself is constantly trying to escape. So it is a fact about the world that is divergent, and that is what's forcing these scientific fields to branch out every decade and to produce new subfields, because they are tracking reality, just like the nomads track their horses and track their oases and their sources of water that were the singularities obstructing their space. So that's the last thing I want to say about Bruno Latour and company. Hopefully one day they will come back to their senses, and again, hopefully, mostly from the women that come from my class, feminism will return to its materialist roots, to its materialist origins, and just get back on track. Because right now, it's definitely off track. Right now, it's going off some deep end of idealism, and it's following the exact same mistakes when regarding the history of science. So now, does that mean that the social entities that we talked about yesterday, institutional organizations, communities, governments, cities, do not affect science, or do not affect scientific fields? The habit of talking with very fighting generalities, of course, one very hard to get rid of. And if I use the word science as science in general once in a while, don't hold it against me, because it is a kind of using the word sunset, right? I mean, you are with your girlfriend looking at the sunset, and one thing is to say, look, darling, what a beautiful sunset, versus, look, darling, look how the earth is moving off, and it's hiding the sun, in his mood, by the time you finish that long explanation, well, the moment is coming and kiss me. So sometimes you can use certain words as shortcuts as long as you're prepared, like science or society, as long as you're prepared to cash them in with a population of some. So yesterday we saw how the word the market can be replaced by a population of marketplaces, a population of regional trading areas, a population of national markets, and so on. So, sometimes if the word market comes out of my mouth, you now know I can cash that promissory note with a population. I can always paraphrase myself back into something more real. Well, the same thing with the word science. So, believe me, I watch myself and I try to avoid it. So, dismissing Bruno Latour and dismissing feminists like Sandra Harding, who famously said, the masterpiece of Newton, which is Newton's Principia, Newton's Principia is a rape manual for the earth. It's like, oh my God. It's like, please shoot that hippie now. Does it mean that there are no social effects on science? Of course not. Science is a social activity. Science has a social history. Science occupies a specific place between industry, government, organizations like hospitals, organizations like psychiatric asylums, organizations like prisons, who, even though they have nothing to do with science, they do develop discourses like criminology that attempt to gain scientific status. Does it not have anything to do with any of that? Well, of course not. It does have something to do with it. These are there's several social variables that affect the development of science. I wrote them here. Legitimacy, as we saw yesterday, legitimacy is a property of authority structures. Scientific fields have authority structures. Scientific societies have a precedent, and that precedent can order other people around. And scientific knowledge itself is supposed to be authoritative. If oxygen really exists and phlogiston doesn't exist, well, then assertions as to what is involved in combustion, or assertions as to what is involved in a particular, in respiration, say oxygen is what we breathe, not dephlogisticated air, should have more authority than the assertion what we breathe is dephlogisticated air. So to the extent that there is authority, there is questions about the legitimacy of that authority. Scientists also are subject to questions about prestige. After a few, and let me actually back up before I go into the other two. Let me just give you an example of the legitimacy thing. When the first scientific field was born, classical mechanics, that is astronomy rather, scientific astronomy as practiced by Kepler, as practiced by Galileo, and so on, and of course got immediately into a conflict with the church, because it was asserted that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that the Earth was just one of many planets that's going around the sun, and something that got Galileo, being in house arrest for the rest of his life. Science, or astronomy, physics, was not taught in medieval universities. The only three subjects taught in medieval universities were law, preclinical medicine, that is medicine based on the texts of Galen, which was really pseudo-scientific medicine, and theology, of all subjects. So those were the three legitimate subjects taught in universities, and medieval universities were powerful bodies. Many of them had earned a certain amount of autonomy from their governments. And every important city like Prague or Paris or any city had its university, and they were proud of it. So if you were not taught in that university, then basically whatever your teachings had no legitimacy. They were not part of the curriculum. So when the first scientific field is born, physics,